Hi, I'm Sean,
I'm Rhonda.
and we lead the marriage mentoring at the Rock Family Worship Center. And we are excited to talk with you today about marital checkups. We are excited to be able to have this moment in your life to be able to provide maybe some different ways of looking at how you can grow in your marriage relationship. So let's talk about the need for a marital checkup. Why do you even need that?
You know, a lot of us will have maybe a yearly physical checkup. Why do we do that?
Yeah.
You know, don't we do it to make sure that we're catching trouble spots before they would get out of hand? Or to treat an area that maybe we're having a little concern about?
So if you make a comparison between the health of your marriage and your physical or even your spiritual health, we have some basic components that make up a healthy marriage or healthy physical or spiritual life.
For example, you know, physically, you want to make sure you're eating right. In the marriage, that might look like, what are you taking in? Are you taking in the Word of God? Are you surrounding yourself with other couples that pour into you godly ways of acting and they're good examples for you? Or do you eat junk food, so to speak, feasting on what the media has to say about marriage, or what your friends who have a bad relationship or other friends who maybe are divorced might have to say about your relationship?
All right, so that's what we're going to point you to is biblical thinking about how to deal with your relationship. So you've got exercise. This is how you interact.
You know, when we look in the Bible, when it talks about being exercised in the Word, maybe exercising our faith or exercising ourselves in the level of Word, whether we're on milk or meat spiritually. When we exercise, we're practicing good skills and we're making sure that those are becoming our habits. So when we are exercised in the fruit of the Spirit or in ways the Word of God shows that we should act as godly husbands and wives, we're exercising.
So there can be marital muscles, you might say, that you might not be using that could atrophy because of lack of use. And so by using them more, we become more accustomed to acting, responding, and thinking in certain ways. So another component of this would be fresh air and sunshine. What does that look like?
You know what? One thing that really brings a lot of fresh air and sunshine into a marriage is going on dates regularly, where we're talking about our relationship. We're not talking about everything else in those moments.
Dream setting, making goals,
yes,
getting outside and doing something together.
It does revive and refresh us when we're doing those
It
things.
certainly does. It can bring a lot of fresh air into the relationship.
Yeah. We want to prevent backsliding for
Gracious.
sure.
That's right. You know, something about spiritually backsliding, you know, that can kind of creep up on a person and they don't really even notice that they're moving backwards. And so we want to be on our toes in our relationship, in our marriage, and we want to make sure that we're not slowly creeping back.
Because just like the devil would tempt someone to backslide spiritually, he also tempts couples to backslide relationally.
That's becoming cold, really, cold and distant and not caring.
If we're not pushing to grow forward, we can stagnate and go backward. We know with our walk with the Lord, if we're not pushing and growing, we're probably losing ground because it should be a continual growing process.
And growth can be one of the best deterrents for backsliding.
For sure.
If you want to see where you're going, you kind of need to start off knowing where you are now.
We can sort of grade our marriage individually and as a couple. So what we might want to consider is on a scale of like 0 to 100, for example, if you were in school and you were grading your work, where would you rank the marriage? Would you say, you know what, I think we're like a 95. I feel really super happy. There's always room for growth. But I do feel that it's positive. Or what I say, it's an 80. You know, it's toward the positive end, but there's a lot of room that we could change and adjust.
You know, I think it's just a little bit humorous sometimes to realize most of the time when men grade, they grade the relationship a lot higher than the women do.
True.
And understanding that concept is that women are typically more relationally oriented and more tuned in, I guess you'd say, on some of the finer details. And men can score that a lot higher.
And men may be looking more at the physical components and the lack of negativity, and women may be looking at the emotional components and the spiritual components and the lack of resolving issues, the lack of working through things. So we score differently. But
Yeah,
you know what?
that's
That all
true.
comes together into the picture, and we can't discount either side.
Right. So look at what are the things that when you establish that score, what are the things that you knocked off for, that you
Yeah.
counted off for? You know, we would have a higher score if this wasn't present, for example,
Right.
or if this was present,
Yeah.
we would score higher. So think
Yeah.
about those things.
What came into the picture for you that caused you to push that up a few points? Those might be the things in your picture that you see that are positive things.
So we need to know, you know, for the man, here's what you define as a healthy relationship. This would be present, this would be happening. And for the woman,
Yeah.
she needs to do the same thing.
We need to compare our definitions
right.
of the healthy marriage
Right.
and have kind of a joint couple definition of a healthy marriage that includes the concepts that both of us bring to the table.
Right. And so if, for example, I'm doing something that in Rhonda's definition of a intimate or healthy relationship, that would not be taking place.
Yeah.
But I'm doing that, then it may not be my definition, but if
Right.
it's hers and I'm acting in a way contrary to that,
True.
I'm taking the relationship in a negative direction.
Because doing or not doing certain things can redefine the definition to equal not healthy, not stable, not intimate. And if we don't know, we're not aware of our definitions of a healthy marriage, a stable marriage, an intimate marriage, and we're crossing those lines, we're defining the marriage, just not defining it like we want to define it. So we have to be verbal. We have to talk through these things.
So that's talking about where do you fall within those definitions.
Right.
And then you're going to be talking about how do we repair those areas that
Yeah.
need to change.
And then once you feel like you've met each other's definitions of a healthy marriage, you could consider the definitions of a positive marriage or the definitions of an intimate marriage.
Wow.
What does that look like? And how would we move from here to there? If our marriage was more positive or more intimate, we would be doing or not doing what? What do you see? What do you envision when you picture that? You need to be able to verbalize these things to your spouse so your spouse also knows.
And I would imagine if you're watching this video, it's probably because you realize there is something more to be had
Right.
in the relationship, and that you are not satisfied with just having a mentality of, well, we've arrived, this is all that's
Yeah.
available. So saying all that to say that we do need to have an idea that there's more available for us than we're currently experiencing, and there's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with that. I think it's just like in our relationship with God, we realize there's more out there, and we're never going to reach the end
Right.
of all that we can have in our relationship, either in our
Right.
marriage or with God.
And the thing is, one thing we have to acknowledge too is when we look at each other's definitions, regardless of what level we end up defining, we have to go with the one who's got the lowest score.
True.
That's the one that ends up setting the pace. Because you know what? If I rank the relationship as a 95 and Sean ranks it as an 80, there's some problems he's seeing in the
Right.
picture. There's some things he's lacking. And I'm just myself thinking it's a 92, but it isn't. It's lower. We have to take the score of we have to take the lowest score.
Right.
And we have to work from that placement, you might
Because
say.
that's the person that has the most challenge in the relationship. So next, let's look at some of the different aspects of a healthy relationship.
One of the biggest things is our relationship with the Lord. If things aren't right this way, they're probably not going to be right this way.
God's the one, obviously, that established marriage, so we want to make
Yeah.
sure that the spiritual component of our relationship is intact. So where are you
Yeah.
in your relationship with the Lord, in reading your Bible, prayer, and worship?
These you need to work toward daily if you're not already focusing on the Lord in a daily way, taking in His Word, which is what changes our hearts and our lives, right? We want to be involved in regular church attendance and life group attendance and fellowship with other believers, because those things have a sharpening effect on our personalities. They kind of pull us into line when we're observing, hey, other people with healthy marriages aren't doing this. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this.
Right. And then also there's the aspect of serving or ministering together as a team. We want to look at roadblocks. These are things that need to be removed out of
Right.
the picture so you can have a healthy relationship.
These are the problem spots for you. These are the things that trip you up, step on your triggers, or set you off and cause you to escalate or close.
So are you staying current with each other? What are the things that have happened? Are you talking regularly
Yeah.
and having a time to bring up any issues that are present?
Or do you let things kind of build and then you explode periodically because you're not staying current? So you might need to make a period of time where you're methodically at set times for set periods of time working through issues and until you get caught up. And once you're caught up, you can always ask the question, is there anything we need to address?
that's a good
What were your thoughts
question.
and feelings today?
That's right.
To kind of pull those things out of each other.
One thing to be aware of is that in the dynamic of that many times in a relationship you have one that's more confrontational, one spouse,
Oh my,
and
that's
one that's
huge.
more non-confrontational.
Right.
So you want to make sure for the person that's more non-confrontational, what can you do to create a safe environment for that person to
Right.
be safe, to feel safe, to talk about issues?
Because as marriages become more conflicted, you typically have the dynamics where you have one person who's verbally pursuing and the other person who's verbally running away. To the extent you have that happening, you're probably having more and more distance. Usually someone is pursuing because the other person is not resolving issues and we can't talk in that relationship, and they can go into a panic mode and begin to chase and force and insist.
Yeah.
But the one who's withdrawing is usually withdrawing because the other one is presenting poorly, which both can do that, right?
Yep.
But also because the other one can come across as verbally aggressive or controlling. And a person tends to shrink back, especially if they're more non-confrontational.
Yeah. So let's look at what are some of the difficulties that each one of you see when you have a conflict. These can be things like facial expressions, tone of voice, body language. What is
Choice of words,
choice,
certain words we're
right,
using.
things that are shutting your spouse down. Maybe when you're bringing up an issue, you have a certain way of presenting it that shuts them down.
These are some good things to talk about when you're not in conflict.
That's right.
To be able to call attention to it or make the other person aware of in a matter of fact way, right, with not a lot of emotion, not a lot of intensity. Hey, there's certain tones of voice that really shut me down. And then to come up with ways to alert each other in the moment. Hey, would you mind trying that again? Your tone was a little too intense for me.
When that happens, sometimes we can think, well, I didn't mean it that way. But, sometimes it can be an influence of something from that person's past, and you need to make
Yeah.
a change so that they can receive in a positive way
True.
from you.
Because the thing is, if we have wounds in there and the spouse is jabbing at them, we're really posing a temptation there
Right.
for them to respond badly.
We call that triggers, right?
Right.
Or hot buttons.
Yes. And so we want to be able to know, how can I respond differently that would come across as positive or at least neutral to you? We can stay off the ways of responding that come across as negative.
Like I felt like you became defensive when I said this. Do I need to say things differently?
So basically you want to maybe have a discussion of what escalates or closes you. Be able to first maybe make a list individually of the things you notice. This is what happens to me when we're discussing a marital issue. And this is what is causing me to escalate and go get more verbal or to get more upset. Or if I close and pull in my shell, pull out of that conversation, and then I'm difficult to interact with. What are those things? If we can pinpoint those and then maybe take a moment and just let our spouse be aware, these are some trouble spots for me. I know you don't intend them to be difficult. It's me that is having the difficulty with this type of thing.
You're creating an awareness. I want you to be aware that this is taking place. So next, let's look at taking a recent negative interaction and breaking it down into pieces and seeing where it went bad.
And we can usually trace that back and keep going back to where it started. And we can talk about, and this is only if your marriage is stable and healthy enough to do this. Obviously, don't do any of these things if it isn't stable enough to go there.
Right.
Find what you can do and start there with where you're both comfortable.
And be willing to make changes. You know, you may say that
Yeah.
a certain thing is not a problem. I might say that something is not a problem for me, but if it's a problem for Rhonda, I can't just, bulldoze ahead and say,
Yeah.
it's not a problem for me, so I'm going to keep doing it.
It shouldn't be a problem for you.
Right.
It doesn't bother me.
So we obviously need to be willing, each one of us, to
Yeah.
make changes to help the other one receive what we're presenting.
Right. And so we can't dismiss or devalue or invalidate what the other person's experience is in that moment, because we want intent to equal impact. Intent is what I meant. Impact is what the other person receives, the message received. If we can never have a welcoming environment to hear impact, we can never adjust and become a better communicator. And so when we break down those negative interactions that went wrong, we're taking each step to see how could each party have adjusted for that to have a more positive outcome, because we want to be able to do something different next time. It's not a matter of saying bad boy, bad girl for what already happened that you can't change.
We want to keep learning and growing.
Yeah, and that should be the goal of it. So
if you want more information or a little bit more information along this line of conflict resolution, we do have some other videos available. We have a life group, He Said, She Said, that centers around conflict resolution.
You can ask for us to do a marital checkup with you, or you could ask for marital mentoring. Any of those things could help you walk through those difficult spots you might be having.
All right, let's look next at the area of sharing needs, desires, and dreams.
If you've got a lot of conflict going on, you might find it difficult to go there and hear those.
Right.
But to the extent that you can, this is critical for developing intimacy. If we can't talk about where we want to go from here in the various areas of life, right? Then we're not really growing together. But the thing is, we can have the same expectations if we're on the same page and we know we're going to the same place and in the same manner.
Right. And so to do that, we need to talk about what our needs are. So this kind of is different from roadblocks, things that need to be removed. Needs are representing things that need to be present, things that need to come into the picture so that you can have a healthy relationship.
For the woman, the biggest need is almost always more communication and deeper communication.
Emotional intimacy.
Right?
Right.
For the men, it's usually along the physical lines. He wants to feel loved by the way he's touched, by frequent enough sex for him, the smiles, feeling like everything is positive in the environment of the home.
More what we call the shoulder-to-shoulder relationship.
For the man, and
Right.
face-to-face for the woman.
Right. So you want to regularly share your needs, your desires, and dreams. If you dream together,
Yeah.
isn't that just the fuel, really, for
Yeah.
propelling us forward? We've got to be on the same page. And
Yeah.
I think having a dream for here's where we're going, here's what we want to
Right.
do and accomplish.
And like we said in the beginning, it's kind of like that breath of fresh air, the sunshine, that kind of helps make everything feel refreshed and revitalized.
So if you're not doing that, what's hindering that
Yeah.
from taking place? Maybe when one of you brings up a dream in a certain area, does something happen that feels like
Yeah.
that gets squashed?
Yeah, we don't want to squash each other's dreams and all. We want to be able to hear those. It's okay to dream and feel like it might never happen, but goodness, can I dream?
Yeah.
Can I imagine? Because sometimes God can step in those moments.
That's right.
And when we have a dream or something we're feeling or sensing, sometimes it can be prophetic. It can be something that if we can step aside from our carnality, God might bring some of those things to pass and show us how.
I mean, why did Jesus make statements like, all things are possible to him that believes, or with God, all things are possible?
Yeah.
He's taking the limit off. He's saying, you have an open heaven over you,
Yeah.
and there's nothing limiting you. So we need to have that same viewpoint in our relationship.
The very least we could say is, wow, that'd be amazing if that would happen for you. We don't have to put it down and say, that'll never happen.
Wow.
That can make somebody feel really bad and not want to share.
That's right. So what are the things that would open you up to begin dreaming together, making goals together as a couple?
Maybe take a date and talk about some of these things. You want to be talking about areas like your spiritual life, your social life, your relationships, including yourselves and your children and extended family. You want to talk about your vocation, your mental and emotional well-being, to think about the various aspects of who you are. And those are the areas where you want to talk about your needs and your dreams and your goals. You want to set some plans. How will you reach those? And what would be the first step in doing that?
So you want to see, are you, excuse me, are you withholding information, and why? Why are you holding back? Why are you not talking about certain things with your spouse?
There might be something, an expectation. Well, I expect that if I were to share this, my spouse would respond negatively, and I would just close up and not share, and it would never be heard anyway, so why start?
So there's probably some history there, and it's something that many times we can just box that up and say, well, I had a bad experience, you know, a number of times, but maybe we're making an assumption. Maybe we need to dig a little deeper and find out why. Is it a way that I'm presenting things that needs to change?
And so sometimes we need to ask questions. We can invite each other. Hey, what is your number one dream? How could I help you reach that? How could I help you open up to me? Sometimes it's easier for someone to share when they're invited to than for someone to initiate, hey, it would help me open up if you. So sometimes the asking questions and invitations is a good way to start this conversation.
Right. So let's look at the component of non-sexual and sexual touching.
That's huge, especially for the women. The non-sexual touching is touching that does not lead to sex at any point, and it tends to make a woman feel valued for who she is instead of what her body can provide to the relationship.
Looking deeply into each other's eyes.
Which is huge for the women. It has a connecting feel and can make the woman feel like she's really being heard. We're just going to hit the tops of some of these things.
Right.
These are things that would be amazing for you two to discuss in depth. How are we doing in these various areas? So we may not break it down, but we hope that you will. So noticing bids for attention, those are the little things we do. Like if I glance at Sean and he glances back, he's meeting my bid, isn't he? But if he looks at me like he is now and I don't look back, or I even look away, I'm turning away from. So when we have these little bids for attention, for conversation,
it's
for
saying,
help,
I want to be noticed.
Yes, and we should connect with those. Couples in successful marriages connect, 87% of the time with bids, and I think about 33% in failing marriages. They're really overlooked and not met. If I say, wow, do you hear the bird chirping? Isn't that pretty? And Sean doesn't even respond.
Or just grunt.
Right? Versus if he says, yeah, that's really nice.
Right.
I like it too, you know.
We made a connection there.
Right.
Showing a genuine curiosity. That means you're not just thinking, I know everything that there is to know about her. Maybe when your wife or husband is talking about something, you delve deeper to ask questions.
Right.
Tell me more. I want to find out more.
Because women want to be pursued.
True.
And doesn't it show an interest? If you're talking to anybody else and they say something, and you pursue that topic, even if it's not a topic you know a lot about, but just because you want to show interest in that person, you make them feel important. And it's the same in the marriage.
Right. So let's talk about caring days. This is a really neat exercise that you can do. Each one of you will make a list of 15 to 18 caring actions or words, things that would be meaningful to you. And your spouse is going to pick off of your list 5 of those and do on a daily basis.
These are brief things. They're not like take me out on a date that would take an entire evening. They're things that are brief, like look me in the eyes when we're talking.
Send me a text that you were thinking about me.
Hold me in the morning before you go to work. Ask me how my day went when we meet together at the end of the day.
Make eye contact when we're talking.
They're going to take maybe a minute or 2 or less.
Hold my hand when we go walking. We could go on and
Right.
on. These are just very small things that could be missing, or you maybe you don't know what things are meaningful to your spouse.
Yeah. And one thing that happens when we exchange this list is we realize his needs and her needs are very different.
That's right.
But these are the little things that make us feel cared for, and we probably did them when we were dating, and somehow we just kind of slip up and drop those things after we get married.
You don't want to pick anything that's related to a hot topic or an issue. You want to pick something that's speaking positivity into the relationship.
And if you have unresolved issues that you've been clashing on, sometimes you need to set some boundaries around those. You don't have to be picking at those things all the time. There can be relationship even when there are those areas in the heart that we don't feel comfortable with right now. If we can respect that, think about a best friend relationship. If there are topics you don't agree on, maybe you have different political views or something about your religious views that are not on the same page. Can you still be friends and not constantly be jabbing your best friend over the things you don't agree on? There's some times where we just need to agree to disagree, and that can be okay on certain topics.
What you're doing is you're putting a fence around the issues, and you're allowing your relationship to have some fresh air, to breathe, and be happy with each other the majority of the time, and realize that the issues are over here, and yes, we need to talk about them, but they're in a controlled place that you bring up maybe at certain key points that you talk about the issues.
It basically says to the spouse, you are more important than the issues.
You could consider having set times during the week. We do this many times with couples. You know, pick 2 or 3 times during the week that you're going to have set aside, 20 or 30 minutes to talk about issues.
Notice the 20 or 30 minutes. There's a cap on that amount of time.
It doesn't invade your life. But it can give relief to the spouse maybe that has an issue and doesn't feel like they have a specified time to bring it up.
And it can give relief to the spouse that's non-confrontational because they know they're not going to be attacked at any random moment.
All right, so let's look at the area of emotional intimacy.
So this is the counterpart to physical intimacy. Usually in the relationship, and this can be turned around and different for the male-female, but usually the female wants emotional intimacy. She wants emotional sex or emotional intercourse.
Right, and so that means for the man to find out what are the components of that. What does connecting with you emotionally look like? Have your wife explain that to you. Many times, I think a woman can expect that, well, of course he knows. I've said it before, or maybe are quite surprised to find out he's clueless and doesn't know what that looks like.
And we women have to be okay with coaching. You know what? Right now, I really need to hear, and we need to let our husbands know these things. But women crave for their husbands to delve deeply into who they are. And, but sometimes a woman, because a man doesn't generally let anybody go into his emotional deep parts, his secret places. And so a woman can many times go too far too fast. And this will overwhelm her husband and cause him to withdraw. If a man went too far too fast physically, a woman would think, he's attacking me. He's taking from me. But women don't think about that when they do the same thing on an emotional level to their husbands.
Right. And so it's definitely working with the one who is maybe not as verbally skilled or emotionally skilled, right?
We find that a lot of men don't know what to say in that moment when, say, a woman shares her heart. And that's why it can be helpful for a woman to take the role of a gentle coach. I just shared something really deep with you. I really need to hear, wow, I didn't know you were experiencing that. Connecting comments can be something along the line of, that must have been difficult for you. Wow, thank you for sharing. That's good to know. Good point.
Many times I don't know what to say. I don't know what Rhonda needs to hear. And so it's okay to ask, what do you need to hear from me right now?
Right. And a lot of times men don't grasp the woman's need for emotional intercourse. He knows he has a need for physical intercourse, but, men, if you can imagine, if you went for a prolonged period of time without those physical needs being met, how might that impact you? Imagine if the same thing happens for the woman and these things are withheld from her for a period of time that's extended. So husbands can learn from their wives the skill of relating intimately in a way that can be satisfying for both. You might need to do this in phases if it's something you're not already doing. So you want to start slow and interact there for a bit until the husband is okay with it, or if those roles are reversed, until the wife is okay with it. And then you might want to talk about, how could we take that even farther? What would the next level look like?
What is the wife's definition of emotional intimacy? What does that look like? What are the components of that? What would make you feel like I'm connecting with you?
Because a lot of women are very vague when they talk about this. I want my husband to spend time with me, and he's thinking, what does that look like?
Or be more romantic. And
Right.
to me, sometimes when that word was used about romance, it's like I just totally drew a blank page.
Yeah.
All I could think of was maybe a candlelight dinner or date or a
Right.
movie or something or other, but it was kind
Yeah.
of vague when you talk about just everyday life.
Yeah, and so the thing is, we have to be able to define that. Well, for me, emotional intimacy would look like this. We would be sitting there, just the two of us. We might be holding hands. You might be looking deeply in my eyes. And we're sharing our thoughts and feelings. We're sharing some deeper things that go on that I never tell anybody else. And you're okay with that. Even if it's challenging for you to hear, you still are okay with and appreciate hearing the goings on inside of me.
We don't want to make assumptions that my spouse knows what I have need of, but yet we haven't really verbalized it clearly.
Right.
Where they can understand what it feels like to be you.
Because a lot of women are expecting their husbands to think like a woman, and he doesn't. He needs to learn how to embrace female, and we sometimes have to help with that so that it's not uncomfortable to the male.
We want to talk about the inhibitions that a husband might feel for going deeper with his wife emotionally.
If a man knows that if I share myself with my spouse, it's going to explode. Women, if we set a precedent that, hey, anytime we have a deeper emotional connectivity, it explodes. It takes 2 or 3 hours or several days, and it feels distance, and we have the cold shoulder treatment while we resolve this. A man will withdraw from and run from such a thing.
The intensity, many times I think a man will opt to have peace and forego emotional intimacy, whereas a woman will push through the lack of peace to have emotional intimacy.
Yeah, and so when we understand that, we can be gentle with the men in our lives. And, one thing I like to share with women is Jesus said to the disciples, I have a lot of things to say to you, but you can't handle them now. It's a godly thing to hold back on information when you know the other person can't handle it. Know the audience, which in this case is your spouse, and what can they handle, and only feed them what they can handle. Once they get good at that level, you can go a little bit deeper.
So let's look at actually creating a plan to increase emotional depth and connectivity.
You would schedule maybe a number of times per week to engage in emotional intimacy. This is going to look like sometimes, when you're really busy, you might schedule a number of times per week for physical intimacy. You can do the same thing for emotional intimacy. Well, on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sunday afternoons, let's plan a period of time, maybe for 30 minutes, where we're going to connect emotionally.
And so, again, this can be a really mysterious area for a man, but just try to relate to the actual need that a woman has for that emotional connection, and that she can feel starved, and that many times that is the area that a woman feels need is not being met sufficiently.
So if a woman is starved emotionally, she will behave in an irritable way. She will be in a panic mode. She will pursue emotionally. Now, these are not good things, ladies. So these are not things we want to continue doing. We need to withdraw from these things. But this is the way a woman tends to act. She will be moody. She will be difficult to please. You'll feel like you can just never please her. You'll never measure up. This is the way it feels to interact with a woman who's emotionally starved. However, a woman who's emotionally nurtured and satisfied is going to be easier to connect with. She's going to be more approachable. She's going to feel more at peace and relaxed because she feels cared about. and she's going to be more likely to want to meet the male needs.
Think about the comparison of being deprived of sleep or food and how
Yeah.
irritable that a person can be when those needs are not being met.
And we're going to talk in a minute about the male needs, but right now, notice they flow similarly.
They do.
So, you could take maybe 10 to 20 minutes when you have your 2 or 3 sessions a week for emotional connectivity. Start slow. Let your husband know, let's just do this for 10 minutes. Okay, so let's sit here. Can we hold hands, face each other, and look in each other's eyes? You might start with just doing that with a pleasant look on your face, a pleasant expression at first, and just saying some things like, how did your day go today? Can you tell me a little bit about your high and low? Start slow. Don't go deep and don't go fast. Think about it like if physically you're on your honeymoon, it's your first time to go physically intimate with someone. You don't go too far too fast because it's uncomfortable. Same thing here. You don't go too far too fast. It can be uncomfortable for the spouse that's never been there before. And
Right.
so,
And sometimes I think we can withdraw from something because we don't feel comfortable with it, as if our comfort level was the
Yeah.
making the call about whether or not we deal with something.
Right.
And many times I think we have to push past something that we may feel uncomfortable about so that we can have something greater. Everything great in life that we receive or area that we move into is not preceded by comfort.
Right.
You probably are going to feel uncomfortable as you push
Definitely.
past and have a breakthrough in areas.
think about if you want to grow in your walk with the Lord. You want to increase your quiet time, your time of worship, prayer, Bible study, church attendance, or ministry level of involvement. That's going to take a push. You're going to have to make some time in your schedule and some focus in your brain to do that. But men, when you connect emotionally with your woman, it makes sense to her for it to express physically. And so usually for a woman, sexual expression should be an expression of something that's going on an emotional level. But yet if there's not an emotional connectivity, physical connectivity just doesn't make sense to her.
And so you want to be consistent with this. You don't want to just do it one time, meet an emotional need one time, and that did it.
And women, you can let your husband know. You could agree ahead of time. When we have our period of time where we connect emotionally, this is what we'll talk about. And stick to what you decide. If you decide we're going to have emotional connectivity on Tuesday night at 6 o'clock for 20 minutes and we're going to talk about what we did and our highs and lows for the day, then only do that. Don't shock him with, and so what are you mad at me about? Why won't you talk to me? Don't go there, because you're not either one ready. If you're in this level at least of interaction, you're not ready to go there.
So we want to regularly evaluate how it's going and how you can improve. Everything that we do, we move into new and better areas in our relationship. That doesn't mean that we're never going to have to tweak that and make adjustments, and maybe we took 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, but you're still making a forward momentum, right?
So we want to evaluate how we're doing, and then when both spouses are comfortable at that level, you talk about what the next level would look like and how you'll get there from here.
Wow, we've covered a lot of material here.
Yes.
You might want to take a break and kind of let this sink in, what we've talked about. You don't want to just hit and skim the surface.
You can't cover everything in one sitting.
Right. So we'll get back into some more of this with you after this. Hopefully you've had some time to discuss some of the things that we've covered previously.
There was a lot of material there, and there's a lot still to come, and you don't really need to cover this all in one session if you're really going to give it your best shot. But let's get going on some more material that would be great for you all to talk about, to make sure that you're kind of checking the various areas of your marriage.
So physical intimacy is an important part of the relationship. Many times there can be a lot of misunderstanding and maybe almost this unspoken code of silence about it.
Right, but we need to talk about our sexual connectivity. It's what the man brings to the marital table, And it's just as important as the emotional connectivity.
You know, many times we look at it like that the man is the overseer of the physical intimacy and the woman is kind of an overseer of the emotional intimacy. It's like we are guardians of a certain area of that relationship.
True. And so if either component, the emotional or the physical, or even the other layers that are involved in who we are, if those get out of sync, or we're leaning toward, we take care of the physical intimacy but we don't take care of the emotional intimacy, or vice versa,
One feeds the other many times.
it does. And what we don't want to see is one spouse is suffering in the
Yeah.
relationship because their basic need is not being met.
No, and if we're not being verbal about what our needs are, we can't expect our spouse is just going to know when
Right.
God wired each of us differently than the other one.
And so this is something that we need to openly talk about. We don't want to assume in any area. So in the physical area, one thing that we see in the research is that men long for their wives to sometimes initiate, be responsive, and also enjoy the sexual activity.
Right. So mutual satisfaction is a key part of what a male needs typically in the physical intimacy.
Right. And so a lot of times, though, the couple doesn't talk about what is needed for there to be mutual satisfaction, or for the wife to care to initiate, which she will more likely if she's taken care of emotionally.
Yeah, if you make a comparison, you know, if you stop and think, if a man was to respond to his wife as, yeah, I'll sit down and take time to talk with you in sort of a reluctant way,
Yeah.
that wouldn't come across very well. You want to feel like that,
He's
you know,
engaged.
yeah, he's
Yes.
engaged, his heart and soul is in it, and yes, let's sit down and let's emotionally connect.
Right.
Well, that same excitement and interest in that area and meeting that need
Yes.
is the same thing a man needs in the physical intimacy.
And we need to both be meeting each other's core needs with exuberance, right? And so if a woman is responding sexually to her husband as if it's a chore, and she's just taking care of another thing, okay, well, let's go ahead and get this over with. That's not going to meet the need any more than if a man sat down to talk with his wife and meet her emotional needs, and he said, all right, let's get this done. How long do you need here?
Yeah.
2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah.
Can you get done in 5 minutes? You know,
Yeah.
so we have to both invest
Right.
in each other. The fact is, we're reaping what we're sowing.
That's right.
And what are we sowing?
And the level of interest and attentiveness that we give to each other's need is reciprocal, okay? So it's, you know, what I do to invest emotionally is the same thing that you reap back physically.
And so if you both think of your basic needs, women think of your emotional connectivity, men think of your physical connectivity, and like we said, some of this can be reversed in a percentage of the relationships. What do you need to see from your spouse? And that's what you also need to be giving. But a lot of times the women are withdrawing physically because of the lack emotionally, and the men withdraw emotionally because of the lack physically. And so this kind of can begin or be a part
A
of
cycle.
that. Yes, that male-female cycle of the male pursuit, female withdrawal, which remember we talked about in the emotional connectivity. She will pursue, he will withdraw. But in the physical state, when these needs aren't taken care of, he's pursuing physically and she's withdrawing.
Yeah.
When the opposite needs are not being met.
So this would be a good place for the two of you to talk about what makes you feel that there's a sexual connection and that need is
Right.
being met.
Ask questions.
Right.
What do you need to feel connected sexually? So when we look at the wife's need, a lot of times, especially if we have younger women with babies or toddlers or a lot of children, or children that are home all day, they're exhausted by the end of the day, emotionally and physically. And so what we need to do, and regardless, we have women that are working and doing all sorts of things during the day. If a woman will know that, you know, this evening I want to take care of my husband sexually, she can prepare for that. She
Yeah.
can be thinking thoughts that stir her heart toward him. She might take a nap, or the husband might take a weight off of her and do some of the
That's what I
chores,
was just thinking.
take care of the children, give her space
there
for a
could
nap.
be maybe a chore or something. That sometimes, a woman can't just lay down everything that's going on with the children or the housework and just say, men, I think, have a knack for that, maybe just the way we're wired, to be able to just kind of block out things that we want to
but a
block out of
wife
our mind.
can't.
And a woman has that
Yeah.
connectivity to everything that's going on, and she may have a hard time laying down, the fact that maybe the sink's full of dishes and maybe the
Right.
children need this or that going on. So saying all that to say a man could jump in there and maybe wash some laundry,
Right.
help
Say, why
help
don't
do
you
this.
go rest a minute?
Yeah.
Why don't you go take some time to unwind? Let her refresh herself.
Yeah, and of course, you don't do the thinking for her. Ask her what she needs.
That's always
Right?
key.
Don't
So,
just assume things.
right. And so, women, if we can appreciate that just like we need emotional connectivity, the husband needs the sexual connectivity. And so, a woman will tend to go into a panic mode when that need isn't being met for her. Men tend to become maybe frustrated and irritable. They
Right.
tend to withdraw and go silent maybe when their physical needs aren't being met.
Right, and God designed us this way. This is not, none of us just put this upon ourselves. This is the way God
Yeah.
wired us, and He made us to be this way. So we need to understand, how did our Maker design us to function and those
Yeah.
needs being met.
And just like we encouraged you to talk about your emotional need for intimacy, what would that look like if you were meeting it? Also talk about your sexual need for intimacy, and what would it look like if you met that need?
This is a good place, for husband and wife to talk about, what are the inhibitions? Maybe what is holding a wife back from
Right.
responding more in the sexual area?
If we don't talk about these, we're unaware and we can be negligent. So we have to be able to talk about these to understand what's standing in the way of both spouses enjoying their sexuality, developing their sexuality, because a woman needs to stay in touch with her sexuality. A man doesn't have to work at that, but
Yeah.
a woman tends to have to work at that.
But a man does have to work at being connecting in an emotional
Yeah.
area. So we both have areas that we have to work on.
But when we women stay in touch with who we are sexually and see ourselves as sexual beings, we're more likely to think in that direction, especially if the husband is supportive and for example, doesn't just pursue her sexually with sexual touch, but includes the non-sexual touch, which is huge for the woman
Right.
to be more sexually interested.
Which can be kind of hard for a man to understand what
Right.
non-sexual touching
Good
looks
topic
like.
to talk
Yeah,
about.
because I think the lines can be really blurred there.
Because for a lot of men, all sex touching is sexual touching, and they're like, what is non-sexual touching?
Yeah.
And so understanding the difference in the wife's needs there. But so we would encourage you, develop a plan to meet this need. Maybe schedule a number of times per week that you will set aside to meet this physical connectivity of sexual need here. What is the frequency that the spouse needs? What is a good healthy number of times per week that you need for your marriage? And so if we set a number of days per week, then we choose which days per week to make sure that this doesn't get neglected. And we work with the spouse that's most inhibited without being demanding. We never want to be demanding in the area of sex, because that can cause the other person to withdraw.
So you want to decide what sex should look like for both of you to meet both of your needs.
Then stick to your choices. So, for example, if the woman is aware that on Tuesday nights we are going to be sexually intimate, she can start preparing her mind and heart and body in that direction, so she's rested, refreshed, and thinking that way. But if we start breaking what we decided on and he's pursuing her sexually on Monday, then, she's going to feel, kind of lose some of the focus on that, because it's like there's nothing to depend on, and she's going to feel chased. Where if he does the same actions without it ending in sex on Monday, it can actually prepare her for Tuesday.
You want to regularly evaluate how it's going and what changes need to be made. For example, in the area of making a budget and doing something in the financial area, you're not just going to hit it right off on the very first time. So expect that when you talk about this and you start implementing, some changes, go back and revisit that on a regular basis and say, how is it going in our sexual relationship and what are some changes that need to be made?
And when you're comfortable at the current level, then you can talk about how could we take this farther? How could we enjoy our sex life with each other even more?
So let's talk about where you want to grow from here. So you want to have a vision for where do we want our relationship to be? What changes do we want to see to get us where we need to go?
So to do that, we need to know where we are and where we want to be and what would we need to do to get there. What changes do you see? What would be happening or not happening if you were closer in your marriage? And then make a plan to get there and then take the first step in that direction.
Many times just making a plan is what gives us the energy and the focus to be able to move from point A to point B.
How will you define what is forward movement? How will you define what is stagnant or going backward? How will you define something that's toxic? You need to be able to recognize those things to prevent backward momentum, which we can thwart with forward momentum.
Yeah, and obviously you want to keep the openness there to be able to talk about what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, and of course keeping in mind not to be attacking in the way that you're presenting. You don't want to come across and say, well, you're doing this or you're not doing that in an attacking way, but more like, let's get in a conversation about what's going on. I feel that we need to make a change in this area or something like that.
And we want to have a welcoming environment, a safe environment to be able to say those things, because we need to be able to say if something feels negative or is taking us backward, and then thank each other for sharing those things.
So you want to obviously know at what point do we need to involve someone else and get some input. So hopefully there would be a openness and a recognition of when things have maybe gotten very toxic, or we do these marital checkups, in person, or by Zoom, and so we obviously would be open to doing that with you.
And so if you can identify at what point would we reach out for help, you don't want to wait till you're in the moment. You don't want to wait until it's gone way too far down the road and you've got a long way to go to get back. So where do you want it to be before you would call in a third party? Establish those boundaries where if we cross this line, we reach out for help. This is the way we would reach out for help. This is the kind of help we feel that we would want.
All right. So you want to make an evaluation on a regular basis, maybe on a weekly and monthly basis. Where are we in our relationship? So many times we can get busy in life and we aren't even really considering, are we on track? Is this what we want to be doing with our time? Is this where are we investing ourselves in the way that we want to?
Let's look at 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8, and let's also look at Galatians 5, 22 through 23. Let's talk about some things in the Bible that can help us go a little bit deeper in our relationship.
Of course, 1 Corinthians 13 is known as the love chapter, and Galatians 5 is talking about the fruit of the Spirit. So we're pretty familiar with that. So one of the first things in 1 Corinthians 13 he mentions is that charity suffers long and is kind.
In the marriage, if we suffer long, we're being patient. We might suffer for a while, but we're willing to do that for our spouse because we're putting up with things maybe as they're making a new habit, or maybe as they're closed to making a new habit, and we are being kind anyway. There isn't really a place for letting our hair down, so to speak, and acting rudely or being insensitive.
In that God is love, you think about it, this is saying that God suffers long and is kind. And don't you see that he puts up with us with some of the behaviors and attitudes that we have? He isn't just cracking down on us on every little thing.
Right. He still treats us well anyway, and this is what we should be modeling in the marriage.
Right. So kindness, if you think about it, suffering long in the absence of kindness kind of changes its definition. So
it really does.
The kindness is what really sets it apart and says that you are suffering long.
And a lot of people seem to think, I would never treat people at church this way. And yet they would treat their spouse certain ways and talk in ways, well, nobody else treats me like this or talks to me like this. But the thing is, we're believers. And it doesn't really matter what the other person is doing. That's between them and the Lord. What matters is, am I doing the right thing?
You know, excuse me, we have to watch our attitudes, because I think subtly sometimes we can look at treating someone, if we're going through something, then we don't want them to be happy if we're going through
right.
something. And so we need
Or
to...
if they treat me badly, it's okay if I treat them badly.
That's right.
It's like, that's not a godly way to respond.
So the opposite of suffering long and being kind is maybe being harsh, being short-fused.
Impatient, sassy.
Harsh.
Yeah, those are some things that you might see if you're not being long-suffering and kind.
So what's the fruit of the Spirit here?
Right. Well, long-suffering.
That's right.
That's actually a fruit of the Spirit.
Right.
Kindness is another fruit of the Spirit. Self-control. If I don't have a lot of self-control, I'm going to just let loose and do whatever comes natural to the fleshly man at that moment. The fact is, when these things happen in the marriage, we can yield to Holy Spirit to give forth spiritual fruit. And that's kind of the goal, isn't it? And so when our spouse is kind of rubbing us the wrong way, so to speak,
You want to let them come up to that tree and get
Yes.
some fruit.
and so it's working something into or out of us. If I'm impatient and I'm harsh, guess what? The Lord wants to uproot those things, because He wants us to express long-suffering and kindness and self-control.
All right, so let's look at the next thing he says there, is that charity envies not. So this would be a warmth of feeling against someone.
Right. So we want to counter that envies not with having unconditional acceptance without judging the spouse of withholding something that is coveted. If I'm envying, I'm saying, you ought to be doing this for me. You have it inside you to give this to me, and you're not giving it. I'm coveting. Basically, I think of that like grabbing something from someone and they're not offering it to me.
Yeah. So, really, that's really somewhere that we have to establish that this person that I'm married to has the right to make their own decisions,
Yeah.
that I'm not going to force them to do something I want them to do just because I want it. They have the right to choose for themselves.
Right. So for envying, we might say somebody has a good thing while I'm sitting here lacking. So we see self as in need, while another person is doing well. Well, I treat him or her well, and he ought to be doing well to me. So a lot of times there might be manipulation to get what's wanted. There might be anger, judgment, or punishment.
Right. And so what is the fruit of the Spirit here? But peace, faith, and temperance, or self-control. So,
Yeah.
this thing about manipulation is really key, because I think that we need to be
Yeah.
careful that we're not trying to control our spouse. We only have control of ourselves. God did not give us
Right.
control of other people. We can influence other people,
Right.
but we don't control and dominate other people.
And it says also in the word to abstain from all appearances of evil. Sometimes we can come across to the spouse. We may not intend to be manipulative, but we can appear to be manipulative. We got to stay away from that also.
Yeah.
So can you see the Holy Spirit developing fruit as we interact with our spouse?
Yeah. So let's look at where he says that charity does not vaunt itself, it's not puffed up. So what is this vaunting itself? It's not exalting itself, pushing itself forward, not proud, but focused on humility. Goodness, humility in the marriage is huge,
Yes.
isn't it?
Oh my goodness. Because really, when we get proud, aren't we pushing ourselves forward? Like this says, right? We become me-focused, selfish, self-centered perspective, unable to validate the spouse's
Oh,
perspective.
goodness. Yeah. How many times, do we find ourselves, myself included, thinking that just because I have a perspective a certain way,
Right.
I'm invalidating a different perspective
Or
than my own.
if we feel like the spouse is invalidating my perspective, what do? We invalidate their perspective.
Right.
If we get this all about me, we see only our contribution
Right.
and gifts in the relationship, and we belittle the spouse's contribution and gifts in the relationship.
Remember, he said the two shall be one. He didn't knock out any
Right.
one. Both of you together are equally contributing
Right.
and finding out what oneness looks like as a team.
And the fruit of the Spirit that we saw related to this, and you might see others, but would be goodness and meekness. So if
Wow.
I'm not pushing myself, forcing myself in my way on my spouse, I'm being good to him. I have a spirit of meekness.
Right. So next it says, charity does not behave itself unseemly. And this would be not acting in an unbecoming way, but caring about what's attractive to the other spouse.
Wow, what's appealing to the spouse, what the spouse would like and appreciate. You know, in 1 Corinthians 7, and we've talked about this a lot in a lot of the teaching that we do, we're supposed to be seeking to please our spouse. So we wouldn't be behaving ourselves in an inappropriate, unbecoming way. We would be looking at how should I behave in an attractive way that would draw my spouse to
Wow.
me, not push my spouse
Wow.
away.
And that's really good to be looking at what's drawing and appealing. Fruit of the Spirit in this area would be gentleness, goodness, and self-control.
And so instead of not caring about the effect of our behavior on the spouse or the relationship, not empathizing with the spouse, we instead would be gentle regardless of the way the spouse acts. We would still be good to them, and again, exercising that self-control.
Okay, next let's look at seeks not her own. And this is not obviously desiring your own agenda, but caring about the good of the spouse and the relationship and seeking to please your spouse.
Just like in 1 Corinthians 7, the opposite would be going after what I want, regardless of the effect on the spouse and at the expense of the spouse. Selfish, this can lead to the roommate mentality, independent, doing our own thing.
Right. And so fruit of the Spirit in this area would be peace and goodness.
Right? Can you think of the peace that would bring to the relationship?
Yeah.
If we would just not be seeking our own thing, but seeking to care for the spouse, if both spouses are doing that.
Right, not looking to be self-promoting.
Right?
All right, so charity is not easily provoked. So it's not getting easily exasperated or stirred up against, but it's calm and approachable and able to interact in challenging situations.
Approachable is huge. If we remain approachable, and it talks in another place about the wisdom that's from above is first approachable.
Well, it's easy to be entreated.
Right.
So think about that.
Which is approachable.
Yeah. Am I creating, that's in the book of James, he said, are we creating an environment where our spouse can
Right.
easily bring up something that needs to be changed? Or am I
Yeah.
giving the appearance like there's this wall
Pushing
there,
away.
right, and you can't come to me if something's bothering you?
So the opposite here would be angry, irritable, unapproachable. We create great distance in the relationship, whether we know it or not.
Right. So just, you want to think about what would Jesus do, right? That used to
Yeah.
be a real cliche phrase.
Yeah, how would he respond?
Right.
So the fruit of the Spirit would be long-suffering, gentleness, self-control, if we're not being easily provoked. Self-control is in most of these, I think.
It is, being able to control ourselves.
Right.
Next, charity thinks no evil. So it's not
Wow.
taking an inventory or an account of injurious behavior and can let things go without keeping a tally of what the spouse has done that was unacceptable or offensive.
Refuses to be quick to think that the spouse had negative intentions.
Wow.
Usually, in what we're seeing with couples is the spouses don't have negative intentions. Now, the impact or what the other spouse received of that communication or lack of communication might have felt negative, but that doesn't mean that we determine that because impact felt negative, intent must have also been negative.
Yeah, so in this area, you don't want to be making assumptions that my spouse had an ill motive
Right.
for saying what they said or doing what they did.
It's better to have a question mark rather than an exclamation point.
And ask questions.
Yes.
What did you mean? I don't understand what that behavior meant. Can you explain that to me? Opposite of this would be keeping up with the wrongs, bringing judgment and corresponding punishment, seeing the spouse in a negative light.
Misinterpreting the behavior of the spouse.
Wow.
And we see this a lot in the troubled marriages. excuse me, we have one spouse that is noticing all the wrongs, or both spouses, after
Right.
a point.
And let me interject here that just because your spouse brings up an issue doesn't mean that they're keeping tally of wrongs, okay? And so a lot of
Right.
times,
That's important.
women are more connected with things from the past. So, if they
Right.
say, hey, there's a behavior that you're having, and, this is something you did, 3 years ago or
Right.
5 years ago,
It basically means this is unresolved.
yes, you're right. And they're seeing something that needs to be pointed out. It doesn't mean that they're keeping track of wrong.
Actually, there's a Zeigarnik effect. I don't know if we've mentioned it thus far in this video, but that means that if you have unfinished business, your brain will just keep that in the forefront of your thoughts until you finish it as a reminder.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true when we have unresolved conflict. The brain is seeing that as unfinished business. And we can't just let that go until it makes sense to the brain that it's finished. So that's what's happening in what Sean was just describing. Why women, especially because of how emotional we are and the processing running through those centers in our brains, that once we resolve the issues, we get to close that box, and it makes sense to the brain to kind of set that aside and be done with it.
Women just have are more connected, I think, and men typically are more
Yeah.
disconnected in little boxes with their
True.
thoughts and feelings.
Compartmentalization.
That's
there.
right.
Well, the fruit of the Spirit that related would be love, gentleness, and goodness.
So let's look at charity rejoices not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. It isn't happy to respond according to something that's deemed what the spouse deserves, or see that the spouse gets what they deserved. There's no payback.
Right. It relates and empathizes with God's perspective, do unto others what you'd have them do to you. How many times do we see, when somebody raises their voice, we begin to raise our voice? The temptations are going to be there, but that doesn't mean we have to give in to them.
That's right.
So just because the spouse behaves in a way that maybe is not the best in the moment doesn't mean we need to mean that we would both fall into that trap.
Yeah, you don't want to be retaliatory in your way you're treating each other.
Or glad that when it's not going well for the
No,
spouse.
they got what they deserved.
Right, or you should have listened to me. All of those things are rejoicing when iniquity is going on, when something bad is going
The
on.
fruit of the Spirit associated with this might be goodness and self-control.
Right?
So let's look at charity bears all things, is patiently puts up with the behavior of the spouse that's not preferred, covers the negative event with silence. They're not talking about it or continually bringing it up in an unacceptable manner.
They can tolerate the differences and overlook things. It's important to be able to address issues in the marriage, but sometimes we over-address.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's a place for being able to overlook something. Like Jesus said to the disciples, I've got a lot of things to share with you, but you can't handle them. It's a godly thing to know when that's the case and withhold that information.
That's right. When you are believing in the goodwill of your spouse and knowing that you're on the same team and we're going to rub shoulders, we're going to bump each other sometimes the wrong way unintentionally,
Right.
and just believing that they're good-willed.
And the opposite of this would be being intolerant, announcing wrongs, not letting go of things, and parading the spouse's wrongdoings. Basically, well, you always do this, and you're this way, kind of characterizing the person as being a certain way because we had a negative interpretation.
Right.
Bearing that or shouldering that, like Jesus did for us, is what we're called to do, to model what he did for us.
And those words always and never kind of sting when we make a characterization of our spouse that they're continually repeating a negative action.
And the fruit of the Spirit here would be long-suffering and showing love.
Right. So charity believes all things. This is believing the best and crediting the spouse with positive intentions. And we just kind of mentioned that really in the other about believing in the goodwill of your spouse, believing that they are a good-willed person.
Yeah.
They're not trying to attack you. Obviously, you didn't get married because you hated each other and you wanted to antagonize each
Right,
other
or
the
make
rest
life
of your
miserable.
life. Right.
And this is key in a healthy relationship, because the opposite of this would be thinking the worst, crediting the spouse with negative intentions, increased negativity toward the spouse. Because if we can't focus on believing in the heart of our spouse, where we will spiral downward, and we will then, because out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks, we will begin then to just spew out negativity and see everything the spouse does as negative, which is listening to the accuser of the brethren instead of Holy Spirit, who is the intercessor.
Think about it. There can be some things that we misunderstand, but that doesn't mean we have to believe that our spouse is ill-intentioned. And also think about in your walk with God, you know God is good, and you believe in His goodness. And there may be some things that from time to time you don't understand why something happened a certain way, but that doesn't mean you change and recharacterize God as He's not a good God. You still believe He's good, but maybe you don't understand something that happened a certain way.
And the fruit of the Spirit associated would be faith. It could be faith in your spouse, and you might say, well, I don't have faith in my spouse. I do not believe my spouse has good intentions. But you might have faith in God and His Word.
That's
that the way He lays out in His Word for you to behave as a godly spouse is really the good response. That even what 1 Corinthians 13 says as an expression of love, and God is love, and therefore we should express Him, that's the right way, regardless of what the spouse does. That would be exercising faith in God to be obedient to His Word.
And if you think about it, faith is like a magnet. It kind of attracts to itself. And when if we start believing something negative about our spouse, it's almost like it kind of attracts that negativity to them in a way. And, we don't want to, the next thing is really that charity hopes all things, and this is expecting the good things and having a hope for the spouse and the longevity of the relationship with a positive attitude.
Right. Because the opposite of that would be a negative attitude and hopelessness. It would basically be giving up on the relationship.
Right. And so the fruit of the Spirit here, joy, peace, and faith.
Another thing would be enduring all things.
This is staying, remaining, and undergoing, bearing trials with a fortitude to persevere.
Rather than bailing out, I don't have to put up with this.
Oh, goodness.
We see that attitude so much. Yeah. But you know what? If you made covenant before your God, then you would see that that's just not an option. As long as we see that getting out of this is an option, we would bail. We're not going to endure all things.
Right. If you have the attitude that I don't have to put up with the behavior and the shortcomings of my spouse, this is going to translate over into other areas of life and find yourself not being willing to put up with other people. And that's a big part, really, of just living on this earth, is that we're going to have to put up with people. We're going to have to put up with some behaviors and some attitude and some words that maybe aren't our favorite.
And the thing is, if we're modeling Christ, didn't He put up with some difficult things that we did?
Yeah.
What if He said, I don't have to put up with this. I don't have to put up with you and what you're doing. Instead, He died for us.
That's right.
While we were yet in our sins, while we were yet sinners. And yet a lot of people don't want to live for their spouse who messes up here and there.
And remembering that we have our own faults, and sometimes we lose sight that we also have some things that need to be changed when we become so focused on what the other person needs to change.
And the fruit of the Spirit that would go with that is long-suffering and self-control. And I would add here that when we do the right things anyway, this is one thing we hear from couples when they do carrying items for their spouse, for example, things that they know their spouse would perceive as something that shows you're thinking of me. What we hear them say is, well, when I see my spouse do these things for me, it makes me want to try harder. It makes me want to do the good things for them as well in return.
It's really, like He said in the New Testament, to provoke one another to love and to good works.
And we can do this in the marriage, but when we don't hope all things or believe all things, and instead we respond as if the other person has ill will toward us, guess what? We also can stimulate the spouse to respond with negative emotions in response to us, but because we're really sowing seeds and we're reaping a harvest.
So the fruit of the Spirit here is long-suffering and self-control. So the last thing is that charity never fails. How about that? that you have an assurance from God that if
Yeah.
you will follow and live in the way of love toward one another, and love as it's defined here. So many
Yeah.
times we think of love in the sense that it's this, the romantic, mushy aspect, and certainly that can be there, but love is defined by these
Right.
characteristics.
And it won't give up or become inefficient in the relationship. The opposite would be giving up, not trying anymore, failure of the relationship, or divorce. But if love never fails, it's going to hang in there, isn't it? And always be available.
And so the fruit of the Spirit here obviously is love and long suffering and faith.
And so we would go back over these things and look at each one. To what extent am I operating according to what the Word shows in 1 Corinthians 13 that love is? And what fruit of the Spirit am I allowing to be expressed in me?
So as you look over this passage in 1 Corinthians 13, you can kind of see that it is in a progressive sense.
Yes. So if we look at it from the beginning to the end of what all we just covered, if we look at the things that are the opposites, what love isn't, we can see a negative progression or a negative spiral that you tend to see in couples that are conflicted.
Right. You could kind of start off with the first passage that we talked about, where it says love
Right.
suffers long and is kind, and go all the way to the end where he says that it never fails. And you can see
Yes.
where it's building toward good and greatness, or it's making a regression backwards to the failure of the
And so it's
relationship.
intensifying as you go through it. Look at that. I thought that was very fascinating to see that it's actually showing a flow of loving more or loving less,
Yeah.
depending on how you're looking at
So
it.
let's look at that. So first of all, you could see where it's getting upset and allowing oneself to respond in an unkind manner.
Isn't that how it starts usually? I get upset with something Sean does or doesn't do, does or doesn't say, and then I allow myself to respond in an unkind manner to that.
Then there's feeling that there's needs that the spouse ought to meet, and looking at the spouse as holding back something that I ought to have.
So we can see that we progressed from getting upset and responding poorly to now we're seeing the spouse as withholding something.
Next, you can see one begin to push for their own agenda, thinking of themselves as better than their spouse.
And then we see that move on to they behave unattractively toward the spouse with no regard for the wishes of the spouse. This is when it's getting pretty negative in the relationship.
It is. Then we have the spouse doing things independently of the other one, even if the other spouse gets trampled on, and they have to have that.
Oh, and then they can become easily irritated by everything the spouse does at this point.
And then thinking negatively of the spouse, quickly assuming negative intentions.
And then glad to see the spouse getting what they deserve with no empathy or ability to see the spouse any longer as God sees the spouse.
They won't put up with anything anymore, and everything is unacceptable.
That progresses to seeing the spouse's character as innately bad.
And then there's no more hope for the relationship to improve.
And there's no tolerance any longer for anything in the relationship.
And then ultimately the relationship fails.
So look through this because it's showing that kind of the beginning, the starting, if we look at the opposite of what love is not, to the failing of love. But we can see the opposite in there. We can see how love starts and grows all the way to eternal love.
Yeah. So God is showing here all the components of a healthy and thriving relationship in love, and one that never fails, versus the opposite of it, one that does fail. And what are the components of a relationship that fails? And that's what we just talked about.
And so when we look at the positive progression, we kind of look at that going in reverse order and kind of look at it that way. When we look at the eternal love that doesn't fail, there's a covenant relationship, so divorce is not an option.
That's right. Unconditional acceptance of the spouse as is, which is tolerant.
These are sort of the building blocks of a strong and healthy relationship. There's hope to walk it out to a better place. And so basically, if you look at if things got negative with you, how can you reverse that? So this is kind of what this is showing. So we took it in the direction of 1 Corinthians 13, and then we saw how we could go all the way to divorce by not doing these things. Now we're looking at how to unwind that and go backwards.
Right. And so there's believing that the spouse is a good person with good intentions, and negative assumptions have prevailed due to unresolved misunderstandings.
And so we're changing our perceptive by being intentional now. We accept the spouse's behavior without trying to change the spouse.
And there's empathizing with the spouse, with the desire to see things go well with them, and the shortcomings are being overlooked.
Right? And assuming the positive intentions and discussing the situation with the spouse to understand the truth rather than assuming whatever it feels like.
And there's choosing to hold off on accepting negative feelings associated with their actions, but rather they're discussing it with the spouse instead.
Doing things together to work toward we in the relationship.
Adjusting behavior to be considered attractive by the spouse.
Thinking of the spouse and considering the spouse wishes instead of my own.
And sharing needs with the spouse and allowing the spouse the option to choose a response.
Overlooking the little things and kindly sharing thoughts and feelings as they are requested to grow in the relationship rather than forcing them.
So we were so excited to have had this opportunity to pour into your relationship, and we wish the best for you, what you desire and hope to have in your marriage. And we have other videos. We have Where Do We Grow From Here?
We thought we would include that in the email that you've received. So there's a link. It partners well with this because it's all about developing a maintenance plan and how to recognize when you're going forward, stagnant, or going backwards. There's so much information we could have included. We had to really narrow this down to get this to these 2 videos. But this is a great place for you all to start working on your marriage.
So many times, we might just bring up something that might spark a conversation,
right.
Maybe a different way of thinking or looking at things, and that's what we hope to do.
So basically, we hope that each of the points that we mentioned, that you're going to stop and talk about them. They're loaded. We couldn't go into every point and develop every point. And so each piece that we mentioned could be its own discussion for you all.
Right.
Notice also that there are some attachments to your emails, and these are going to have some bullet points that you can use to remind you of what was in the video. We can meet in sessions to help you over some of these things. If you just have a hurdle or two, that sometimes can be helpful to have a third party involved to just kind of get you through those. So marital mentoring is available. Let us know if that would be helpful for you.
Right. So we also have what we call connect relationships, and this is where one couple is like a mentor to the other one in more of a casual setting.
The traditional idea of a marriage mentor.
Right.
Obviously at The Rock we call mentoring is kind of like our counseling, but this is where you would connect on this social level with a seasoned, godly couple who's available to pour into your life more as an example rather than in the more formal sessions.
Right. So we've all experienced things that have helped us to overcome various hurdles, and these are the type things that these couples will be able to pass on.
If you haven't received that email with the application to have a Connect relationship, let us know. We can send that out to you. You respond by completing the 1 to 2 minute application so we can pair you with a Connect couple and you can get started in one of those relationships. We highly recommend it. We also have some Facebook videos if you want to friend us on Facebook and look under our profile for those.
There's YouTube videos.
And also, we would mention the life groups at The Rock.
Again, it's just been a delight to get to talk, to share, and hopefully just pour into your relationship some things that will help spark growth and vision, to help you see what is available for you. God made marriage to be a wonderful and exciting and building journey for you.
And we're here for you if you need us to facilitate that, to pour into that in any way to support and strengthen you in your marriage.
He didn't make the newlywed experience one that is just going to be the epitome and everything be downhill from there. He really meant it to be going, excelling, accelerating to greater and greater heights.